Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining, everyone. So I'm Helen Doran, and I'm delivering the final presentation today. And just like I did in the book, it's my job to kind of take the fundamentals outlined by Tony, Michael, and Andreas and put them into application for exploration along a transform margin. So very much focused on oil and gas here. I've been working transform margins on and off for 25 years. To start with oil and gas, more lately within geothermal. We don't have loads of time today, so I am going to focus on one single transform margin and to help illustrate how tectonics influence key play elements and ultimately exploration success rates. So hopefully I can go to the next slide. Okay, and the basin that I'm going to show today is the Tano-Ivorian Basin. And it's a really classic example of a pull-apart basin. It's situated between the Romanche and the St. Paul fracture zone. And the setting makes it a really unique natural laboratory to study transform margins because the kinematic evolution is coeval with the deposition of the key petroleum systems elements. So it's really obvious the link between the two. Whereas on other margins, it's a lot more subtle. So let's just start by looking at the structural layout of the margin. The basin has a very distinct geometry, as many transform margins have. You can see that wide eastern end that's offshore Ghana, and that much narrower western end offshore Côte d'Ivoire. And the eastern portion is characterized, as we've heard over and over again during today, by extensional faults, which has led to the formation of multiple pull-apart basins. In contrast, when we look at the western edge of the margin, it's much narrower. It's structurally controlled by that strike-slip deformation. So the structural contrast plays a critical role in exploration success actually along the margin, and we see much higher success rates in the eastern part of the margin where the extensional tectonics dominates. And we want to understand why that is in terms of the key play elements. So we're going to really just focus in on that today and unravel each of the individual play elements. So to start with, we're going to take a bit of a look at the different segments. And we have on the slide here 3 seismic lines numbered 1, 2, and 3, and I'm just going to move through them very briefly. So we'll focus first on the narrow end of the margin, which is entirely offshore Côte d'Ivoire, and that's marked by this line number 1. And this is the area that we know as the transformed sensus stricto that Michael talked about in his initial presentation. Characteristics of this area and of all areas in this setting are that it's undergone minimal crustal extension. So the displacements occurred almost entirely with those strike-slip motions. And as a result, the crust here, and you can see that in the seismic line, remains relatively thick and buoyant throughout its history. And this thick normal crust is juxtaposed directly against oceanic crust, and you recreate that sharp boundary. And this is a very textbook example of a transformed margin sensus stricto. When we move further east off this part of the margin, we encounter a very complex system of oblique and strike-slip faults. And these faults mark the development of a very classical horsetail structure. And I love this block diagram that we have in between the 2 seismic lines. It came from Petrosy back in the 80s, and you can see the beautiful development of that horsetail structure as we move off the transform sensus stricto, St. Paul's transform, into the horsetail. And you see below on the seismic line 2, this characterizes some of the key characteristics of the horsetail structure. So here, the crust is stretched and thin, but it still remains significant. You can see that several small sub-basins have developed, and they're separated by these highs that you see in the seismic line, which remain buoyant throughout the Cretaceous. So just as Andreas was highlighting before, because of the passing of the transform and the timing of that, we have different highs and lows as we move along the transform. So here we have blocks that remain buoyant through the Cretaceous, and you can see the unlap of the Cenomanian stratigraphy onto these. And this is going to be an important part when we come to talk about source rock and traps later on. When we continue eastwards, we see that transition to almost exclusively normal faulting, and the extension becomes much more dominant. The crust here then starts to experience stretching and thinning, and it leads to a series of pull-apart basins. You can see within the pull-apart basins and seismic line 3, there's ample accommodation space, and it makes them very ideal setting for the deposition of source rocks and, of course, the ponding of reservoirs. And this is one of the critical factors for the exploration success in this eastern portion. So we're going to step through the key differences in the play elements across these three distinct but very interconnected zones, and that formed the latter chapters within the book. So there's a lot more information within the book. We will start first by looking at reservoir deposition, which is very strongly influenced by the underlying kinematic framework. If we look at the entire margin in a very broad or gross sense, what we observe is that along the transform sensus stricto, reservoir inputs tend to be perpendicular to the structural grain, and they're very relatively short-headed when you compare it to the rest of the margin. In contrast, as you go into the horsetail, here we see a much more complex system of the reservoirs, and that's highlighted. This is the area in this black box to the east, and you can see it in this beautiful amplitude extraction along the Cretaceous, and the interpretation of that, which is just a personal communication with our friend Brian Cronin, who wrote the paper on the depositional systems across transform margins. So here in this oblique part of the margin, there's much more complexity to the input of the reservoir systems when we compare it to the transform sensus stricto. As the horsetail evolves into more extensional setting, and for those of you who know the margin well, that occurs in the vicinity of the Payon field, and I'm hoping you can see my cursor, which is marked by this very long linear northeast-southwest orientated reservoir input system almost in the middle of the picture. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, apologies if you can't. And when we move further eastwards into the extensional portion of the margin, reservoirs navigate around and over these structural highs. So from the map, we can see that all the reservoirs that are sourced from these multiple entry points throughout the transform actually start to converge on the area of negatively buoyant oceanic crust. And this is very familiar in many transform margins, both here in the Tano and Ivorian, and very similar in the offshore area of the Guyana transform margin. It's because the oceanic crust obviously serves as a very natural sink for sediment input, and there's the potential for stacked reservoir systems here. However, unlike the Guyana margin, where multiple commercial discoveries have been made in the oceanic crust, commercial discoveries offshore this Tano-Ivorian basin have been very limited, although there have been some technical discoveries, which we can look at a little bit later. In terms of charge access, this includes maturation, migration, and the timing of charge. This is a massive topic, probably could warrant a webinar all on its own. So I'm going to focus very much on the very key high-level takeaways from this. We'll start with this again with the transform sensus stricto, which is in the top left, the seismic line represented in the top left. Here you can see that, well, sorry, I should start back up a little bit, but maturation and migration are actually significant play risks in the transform sensus stricto. And this is primarily due to sediment bypass that occurs along a very, very steep slope. The resulting impact of that is that source rocks remain relatively immature to early mature on the slope, and therefore to access charge, these reservoirs must extend down dip and off the sloping towards the oceanic domain. However, here, migration into these reservoirs is relatively diffuse. Unlike other parts of the margin, like within the pull-apart basin and even in the complex oblique strike slip, there's not a lot of structural granularity to help focus vertically before these migration can occur naturally. So, in addition to this, hydrocarbon generation and migration occurred before the active movement of the passing of the transform. So there's a post-charge fault movement that compromises the trap integrity in this part of the margin and increases the likelihood for seal failure and hydrocarbon loss. There's only one technical discovery in this part of the margin in Saphir, and we see that it had, despite a relatively thick gross reservoir, it has a limited hydrocarbon column of 40 meters. And these three elements combine to cause that limited column height. And while we would have technical successes, it's very difficult to get a commercial success in this part of the margin. When we move into the horsetail structure, the complexity of the interplay of those oblique slip faulting has a dual impact on hydrocarbon migration and phase distribution. The faults create very effective vertical migration pathways, so they allow hydrocarbons to move efficiently through the system. But at the same time, the fault generates deep grabens, and these are actually accommodate significant volumes of syn-rich source rocks. And these tend to be more gas prone than the later deposited marine source rocks. Additionally, like Andreas was saying, the continuous movement along these faults mean that the associated horsts remain elevated during the Cenomanian, and as a result, the deposition of the more oil-prone marine source rocks is not as continuous as it is in the pull-apart part of the margin. And together, these two factors of syn-rich source rock and more patchy distribution of the marine oil source rocks tend to increase a gas risk in this portion of the margin. And the discoveries that have occurred here tend to have a higher GOR as a result. Now, in this part of the margin that has, until recently been a problem due to a lack of gas infrastructure, but I guess it's a surface solution can be found for that. In contrast to this, in the pull-apart part of the margin, the gentle and wide slope actually allows for deposition of multiple source rocks, and the subsequent ponding of reservoirs helps the maturation of all of these source facies. In this area, lateral charge dominates, and that's very evident in the largest field in the area, the Jubilee field. And you can see that pressure data, both in the hydrocarbon leg and the water aquifers of Jubilee, really highlight this lateral charging model. So it shows that each reservoir is disconnected from those above and below, and each reservoir taps into a mature part of the kitchen and gets charged laterally rather than through sequential vertical migration. Now that causes variations in the GOR within these systems, but it also tells you the importance of tapping into the mature source kitchen. Migration to younger reservoirs is actually a problem. So we don't have a Campanian play in this part of the margin, despite having beautiful Campanian reservoirs. And that's because the lateral migration dominates. It's very difficult to get vertical migration above that beautiful Turonian top seal. You can see some charges reach one or two fields, such as Odom, and that's where the Turonian is thinner, but in general, it's a laterally dominated charging, and it's very difficult to get charge into the younger stack systems. Next one, trap and seal. So despite trap and seal obviously being two very distinct play elements, we're going to talk about them together today because they're obviously very much interrelated. Again, we'll start with in the transform sensus stricto, and I thank here at this point before I yabber on, the guys at Wildcat who have provided these beautiful statistics and plots for me. So in the transform sensus stricto, combination traps dominate. And you can see that both in the bottom right-hand plot here, where really only combination traps have been targeted, and up here in the cross-section seismic and the amplitude extraction line. So what the combination trap that dominates in this part is actually a fault against the basement high. And the wells Ayami, Saphir, Maru, and Solman have all highlighted amplitudes against this binding fault. And I was part of the team that drilled Ayami back in, I think, 2018, I've forgotten now. Needless to say, no commercial discoveries have been made. And one limit, as well as what we talked about with source rock maturation and migration, another limit to commerciality here is trap volume. And you can see that at the bottom left-hand side of the plot. These are small traps. And this is for two reasons. Both of them are interlinked. The first is the geometry of the trap. So because of that steep slope, you have a witch's hat geometry forming. And the second reason, also due to the steep slope, is that you have reduced effective stress at the apex of that trap, because you have a much thinner overburden here. So your effective stress window is reduced. And for commerciality, you need a really large hydrocarbon column, but it's limited because of that effective stress window. So it tends not to be possible. To further complicate the matters, and we've spoken about this before, the post-reservoir fault movement has compromised both the trap and seal in this part of the margin. And again, Saphir, which is our only technical success, reminds us of that, where only a 40-meter column has been encountered. When we move east to the horsetail structure, where you have much more highly complex and variable trapping styles and sealing styles, and you can see in the plot in the bottom right-hand corner that combination, faulted and stratigraphic traps have all been tested here. But the timing of the passing of the transform, which is active in the Cenomanian but ceases in the upper Cenomanian, means that trap formation partially occurred during reservoir deposition. And this has resulted in compartmentalized traps and the requirement for lateral fault seal. And these types of traps include inversion features, because this is the area where a lot of stress has been absorbed and a lot of fault movement. And these features, while they look simplistic seismically, have been found after appraisal drilling to be much more complex in reality, with a lot of compartmentalization in different fluid contexts across the entire structure. And it's the trap complexity that exists on the shelf in this part of the margin, which is a key reason why many of the fields have gone underdeveloped, despite actually being discovered almost 50 years ago. As we move to the pull-apart part of the margin, this is the most successful domain along the transform margin, with a number of different traps playing a dominant role in the hydrocarbon accumulations. And again, the Jubilee field, with reserves of 690 million barrels, is a really prime example of how trap and seal effectiveness work in tandem. Here, half the reserves are contained in a pure stratigraphic trap, while the other half, that sit above, rely on a combination trap with a up-dip sealing fault. And separating these two faults is a very highly effective lateral seal called the mid-seal unit. And the effectiveness of this seal was so powerful it separated 150 psi difference between them. It actually influenced the entire appraisal strategy of the field. When you move down dip off Jubilee, you encountered more pure stratigraphic traps, and the fields like Pecan and Pecan North are pure stratigraphic in nature. But they have very complex trapping styles, and they're both subseismic and only really revealed during appraisal. One style is multi-sealed stratigraphic traps, or akin to a frayed rope rather than one single up-dip pinch out. And the other, perhaps more unusual, is an overpressured water leg that causes the trapping with hydrocarbons below it. So it's an immobile pressurized water that forms the seal in the trap. Both are effective, but both are subseismic, and it underscores really the importance when you're dealing with stratigraphic traps of detailed reservoir evaluation, as seismic amplitudes and geometries really often fail to reveal the subtleties of these trapping styles. If we move to just summarize everything that we've spoke about today, I hope that we've illustrated quite clearly that the key variations in commercial and technical success across the Tano-Ivorian Basin are linked to the transform tectonics. The map above, I've color-coded that where each well sits per domain and where they're positioned to coincide with the pie chart on the right. And again, thank you to the guys at Wildcat for giving me the stats. If we look at the discovered resources by kinematic domain, it's very much dominated by the pull-apart, the extensional faults, and almost 70% of all the discovered resources along the margin sit in that domain. In contrast, the transformed sensu stricto has no commercial discoveries and only a technical discovery at Saphir. The area of the horsetail it's got a new birth. It's had 2 recent large commercial discoveries. It's in its complexity probably lies opportunity because it's the most complex part of the transform margin, and you need to unravel the timing and the movement with the oblique nature and the input of the reservoirs to find obviously for exploration success, but in there probably lies further opportunities just in its complexity. So I hope I've demonstrated the kinematic evolution of the Tano-Ivorian dictates the distribution of the key petroleum systems elements, and doing so dictates technical and commercial success rates. And understanding the relationship by the tectonics, charge access, trap geometry, seal, is key to unlocking the full potential of the entire basin. And I will leave it just with a thank you to everyone that I personally hounded for information, for diagrams, for support during writing the lateral chapters of the book. A massive thank you. And if you're interested to understand domains and success rate across your transform margin, get in touch, because we like to do nothing more than dissect an entire margin and put everything into context. But with that, I'll hand over to questions and discussions. So thank you for your time today.